Good afternoon. What a nice crowd for a Monday afternoon. Welcome to the museum. This is not a lecture by blues diva Nina Simone, but rather by her namesake, Nina Simon, who is a guru of contemporary exhibit design. Sorry, I had to do a little joke, but I can see it didn't go down that well this Monday. All right. Anyway, Nina is an independent exhibit designer and the principal at Museum 2.0. For those of you who do not know Nina and her work, she has a very distinguished career using social technology to create dynamic, audience-driven exhibitions and programs. The results of her work can be seen at the Boston Children's Museum, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, the Chicago History Museum, the Denver Art Museum, and the International Spy Museum. Some of my very favorites, I hate to say. She's also the author of the blog Museum 2.0, which also appears as a column in Museum Magazine. What I think is really great, and I want to thank Michael Mason, who organized today, and the rest of the exhibits team, but as part of our ongoing professional development here, Michael had reached out to invite Nina to come and develop these workshops at activating exhibitions and websites for social participation. I think we'd all be living in the dark ages if we don't realize that the web and those outreach tools are key to reaching our 21st century audiences. And myself, who helps lead this initiative at the museum, I'm so delighted to be able to participate because I feel like such a Philistine when I'm around my children and others. So I think this is just tremendously exciting for all of us. The topic of today's lecture is the multi-platform museum, building and sustaining visitor relationships across institutional borders. Please welcome Nina.
Well, thank you all for coming. Please continue to fill in. I know I'm speaking both to people who are here, which I'm so grateful for you being here in this space, and then also to people who are on the web, and so hello to the invisible audiences as well. This is how you can reach me, and this is where these slides are if you want to access them later, and I'll throw this up at the end again too, so you can wait to decide whether it was useful enough that you want to look at it again later or not. This is sort of the plan for what we're going to talk about today, just to give you a sense of time. I'm going to talk for about an hour, and then we're going to have a discussion. And so, and if you have to leave, please feel free to do so, and don't feel like you're making anybody uncomfortable. We're going to talk about what these platforms, this multi-platform museum idea is. We're going to talk about the visitor side of things in terms of what they're looking for in terms of a connection. Then we're going to look at the institution side of things, what the Smithsonian might look like relevant and relative to visitors in that way, and then putting it together. I'm a very practical person. I'm an engineer by training, and so while there are many ideas in this talk, there's also a lot of tactics and ideas for things you can actually do. And more than anything, I hope that you leave here ready to do something. And if there are some challenging or exciting ideas along the way, that is great as well. This concept of everyone's Smithsonian came from a site that I'm going to pitch, which is the Smithsonian Web and New Media Strategy Wiki, which you can all go to, which is managed by the New Media Strategy group here. And there's a curator named David Allison. Is he here by any chance? No, okay, then we'll just talk about him behind his back and all over the internet. David wrote this list of what's in and what's out for the Smithsonian, which I found very interesting. And one of the things that is out is our Smithsonian, and one of the things that is in is everyone's Smithsonian. And so I thought this was a pretty interesting idea, and on the one hand, it's easy to say that, and on the other hand, what does it really mean to be able to get to a place where anybody could come in and say, yeah, I own this place? I lived in D.C. for many years. I have a lot of friends who still live here, and I said to one of them recently, this social worker, smart guy, I said, you know, do you ever think about the fact that the public owns all this stuff in the Smithsonian? And he really looked at me like I was insane. And he said, no, they own it. It's in their buildings. They're open from 10 to 5. That's what the story is. And so I think that there are a lot of both misconceptions and opportunities to overcome to really get to a point where even locals feel like everyone owns and is part of the Smithsonian. So this concept of multi-platform is nothing new. We already all live in a place that involves lots of different devices, lots of different media streams, and often when I'm working with museums, I like to think about them in these three buckets. There's the middle bucket of the things that the museum does. There are the external relationships we have, which are usually quite formal, and actually in the case of the Smithsonian actually operates a lot of external distribution platforms, whether it's the Folklife Festival or the radio channel. But then there's this third one over on the right, which is the social platforms, the platforms that visitors use on their own, the ways that they connect with each other, the informal ways that they're connecting with each other around your content. And I'm really going to focus more on that side of the platforms today. Because you have so many platforms, and I'm saying you, the Smithsonian. How many people here actually work for the Smithsonian? Oh, okay, most of the people, at least in this room. Excellent. So I've been amazed looking at the Smithsonian website and just perusing. You know, you have this thing called Websites A to Z at the top, and there are websites for everything. There's volcanic, site. Oh, the Global Volcanism Program. I thought this would be very good, for the Star Trek fans who might misspell something and end up at that site. But there are just so many different things going on here, and so many platforms you're managing. And then also in the last year, you've done a pretty good job at starting to look at reaching out to some external platforms, which are a little less traditional. I guess, actually, this looks less scary now, but when I saw this picture of Secretary Clough and Ben Stiller, this is at the Night at the Museum premiere last week, my first question was, is Ben Stiller a werewolf? I mean, his eyes, it's a little spooky, but if you're listening to the social web and what people are saying about the Smithsonian, both of these events, the Colbert portrait in the National Portrait Gallery and then the Night at the Museum premiere have been very talked about in a way that the Smithsonian is really getting on the radar of some really interesting new audiences. But whether it's the Colbert Report or a movie, these are still pretty formal external platforms that you have relationships with. And what I'm really interested in is this other side, which are these informal platforms. And so I want to tell you my Smithsonian story, which is that about 6 years ago, I was living here in D.C., and a friend of mine came down from Providence, a mathematician. He's this 7-foot-tall Italian guy named Mario. And he's one of those guys who, his arms move around and, knock over small children and that kind of thing. A lot of excitement. He says, Nina, we have to go see the giant squid. He was obsessed with the giant squid. We came down here, it was before the new Ocean Hall was open, and the giant squid was in this room with this weird animation, maybe some of you remember, of the giant squid versus the whale and what would happen, and he wanted to watch it 3 times in a row, and we had this really exciting day that was fueled by his infectious energy about the squid, and I had a connection to that squid, to that story, and to the mystery of that aspect of science through this other person who I was with. I think we all have these experiences in museums. I think that a lot of the people who are coming here, we know are coming socially, and what's exciting them and what they're taking away with them has to do with the people they're with and the social experience they're having. And so, beyond that event, the Mario kind of discussion that I had, there are all these things going on the web. When I started looking for it, there are a lot of people excited about giant squid. There are YouTube channels. There's somebody who's made a cake that's a giant squid cake. There are t-shirts you can buy that say, when I grow up, I want to be a giant squid. And I'm not suggesting that the Smithsonian needs to get in the business of this kind of silliness, but that we need to be thinking about how we're acknowledging, supporting, and encouraging people to connect with each other through this content in their own informal social ways. And so I often use this diagram when thinking about what it means for a museum to be a platform provider. That traditionally as museums we've really looked at how can the museum put out the information, whether it's through a channel like a TV channel, whether it's through a channel like an exhibit or a website, and it's really consistent what you're giving to every audience member. versus something like this image on the right, where somebody like Mario can take me to see the giant squid and I leave with a new experience from it. And what it looks like to make a platform that supports people bringing something with them, taking something new away with them as well. And it's interesting, I use this sentence at the bottom a lot. I believe that it is true that there are huge benefits to going to the right in this diagram. I know the diagram on the left is easier. It is less complicated to send everybody the same message and just use different distribution channels for it. But there are real opportunities with it, and as I looked back at this sentence, putting together this talk, I realized that a lot of this comes back to some of the core mission around the Smithsonian, which is about increasing and diffusing knowledge. And I think the word diffuse is really interesting, and I don't want to make too many presumptions about what it meant in the mid-1800s, which might be different than what it means today. But the idea that there is sort of this global game of telephone happening through the content in the Smithsonian really speaks more to this platform concept than to more traditional ways of delivering knowledge content that museums are more used to. So what I want to look at is this idea of the Smithsonian as a platform provider, and sort of ask the question, okay, what do the visitors need? What do they need as an infrastructure that can support them bringing something with them to the museum and taking something away? What values do you have that are important to you as you set out to think about what a platform might be appropriate for this kind of interaction? And then looking at these squiggles in the middle. A lot of the things I'm going to bring up are technologies, but I often say this is not about technology, it's about relationships. And it's about stepping away from a relationship that's sort of the shouting father model towards a relationship that might be a friend who's willing to listen model, or a friend who has an idea that might contribute to something else in your life model. And looking at and being really honest about what relationships are you comfortably ready or eager to have with visitors. So we're going to start with the visitors. I guess I should tell you that I started out when I worked here in DC, I was at the International Spy Museum, and since then it's become incredibly more easy on the web to spy on people and listen in on what they're talking about. And so these are some of the tools that I use, like Twitter, searching on Twitter, or a site called How Sociable, or a site called Technorati, to be able to search against brand names or things like Smithsonian and see what people are saying. And the next series of slides I'm going to show you are actually from Twitter searches I've been doing over the last couple of weeks. How many people in here know what Twitter is? Oh my goodness, it's like everybody. Okay, short messages people send out to the world. That's for whoever did not raise their hand. And it seems like if you did not raise your hand, you could probably turn to the person next to you if you get confused. So these things are probably not going to be very surprising to you. First of all, unlike most museums that I work with, most museums I work with are struggling to compete with, say, the movies. The Smithsonian is different. This is a coming to Mecca experience. You know, people buy their plane ticket, they plan for months, and they're having an experience which I think there is no other museum in the States that has this stature, and probably the only other experience place that has this stature is Disney. So I think it's interesting thinking about this in terms of you still are a very monumental place in people's eyes in terms of what they're interested in. However, it's also totally overwhelming. And if you try and use the Smithsonian website to figure out where you want to go here, it's a little challenging. There's this other site called Go Smithsonian, which I think is run by Smithsonian Magazine. It's sort of linked through the Smithsonian website. I think it's pretty good, but I had to know it was there to be able to find it. And I don't think that we want people feeling like they have to decide which of their children to give up when they're deciding what they're going to do here. When I worked at this spy museum, I sometimes would pick up the phone at the front desk, and every once in a while you get a call from somebody who couldn't believe they had gotten a real person in Washington, D.C. on the phone, and they would ask you all kinds of questions about how to get from the zoo to, you know, down to the mall, and if they should do Holocaust between doing 4 other museums on the same day, and you would just say, no, you need to take some time. But these are the kind of things people weren't finding on the web, and they needed a personal interaction to be able to figure out. But once they get here, as we all know, people are willing to just charge through, and we've all been here in August in air-conditioned rooms looking out windows at the people who are just slogging their way through the mall because they have to hit everything. I think that this contributes to an interesting relationship to the Mecca experience because people come here, they have a lot of expectation built up, but they also feel like they need to hit it all and that there's a lot they have to see while they're here. This one down in the bottom corner, you might not be able to see it says, "There is no shortage of taxidermied animals at the Smithsonian Castle. There is, however, a tragic shortage of coffee." And I think that the visitor affordances in terms of the experiences you're slogging through the mall can be quite challenging. People are really interested in what you do in your work. They're really interested in how this place happens and what happens behind it. They're also interested in the rules and what rules they might break. You know, it's funny, when I look at these kinds of things, well, I actually have no idea really what this woman, Jane, thinks is going to happen. But when I look at these things, I don't look at them and say, okay, the Smithsonian needs to let people drink inside or have sex inside. But what I look at it and see is that people are aware that this is a place that has rules, and they're poking fun at that. And I think that that doesn't mean that they don't appreciate or think those rules are reasonable. This is the most interesting thing. A lot of people on Twitter talk about X belongs in the Smithsonian. And I also monitor the use of the word museum on Twitter. And when people say X belongs in a museum on Twitter, they usually mean it's old. When they say it about it belongs in the Smithsonian, they're often saying it's of huge value. And sometimes it's silly stuff. I have not washed this cod piece, it'll be in the Smithsonian one day. You know, they're playing with this idea of value. Or they're asking this question of, should the American Idol desk be in the Smithsonian or not? People are really interested in this question of what is a treasure, and they're still associating that strongly with what the Smithsonian is about. So looking at all this, some of these things that it draws me to think that the Smithsonian might provide to these people based on what they're looking for. The first is audience-specific online navigation. This is an image from the Pittsburgh Children's Museum site, which I will show you. This is the site. If we had music on, you would hear the chicken dance music, which may or may not be a good thing. But what they do is, from the beginning, when you come to their site, you decide, am I a kid? Am I a parent? Am I an educator? Am I a museum geek? And if I click on one of these, it takes me to a map of the building and a set of resources that are fundamentally different based on my needs. And it seems like as you are dealing with so many different audiences, whether it's people who visit versus people who will never visit but want to use resources, thinking about it from the perspective of who are you walking in the door online and what might you need is a pretty interesting way to play. I will acknowledge that the Smithsonian website does have that to some extent over here, Smithsonian for kids, teachers, members, volunteers. But if you go to kids or teachers, you get to an education site which gives you great resources but doesn't necessarily relate to whether you're a visitor to the physical space or whether you're looking for resources. And I think you need to think about who are these audiences and what might they want. The second thing with regard to trip planning is looking at how you can personalize the entry points to make it valuable to people. This is a website I love. It's called I Like My Museums. I'm going to give you a little tour of it. It's from the northeast of England, where there are 80 different museums, and they came together to make this sort of marketing site, and you can choose these trails to get in. I like being active. I like doing things as a family. I like sparkly things. I like traveling. I like monsters. I like science. So I like heritage. So if I pick one of these, like I like heritage, it'll show me a list of the museums in this area that have a component related to heritage. And I can make a custom map of the museums I'd like to visit because of that. What's really nice about this is that it doesn't presuppose that you're coming to a museum for any one reason. And there are some of these I likes that are quite strange. There's one here I love. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, I like a nice cuppa. You know, this is from England. This means a nice cup of tea. And these are all the museums in this area that have a really nice place, a nice cafe. No museum is going to put on their homepage, you should come here because we have great coffee. But for some people who are moving through the mall on their visit, at some point that is the museum they're looking for. And I imagine all of us have an idea in our mind of what we would say to somebody if they said, where should I have lunch on the mall? But that's probably not what's on the front of, say, the NMAI's website, despite the fact that insiders have that feeling about the place. What this site also does is they they created these trails originally through a focus group with about 100 people. So they asked people, what are reasons you come to the museum? What do you like? And they put these together. But they also have this visitor trails area where it's people who have made their own trails. And some of these are quite funny. Some of them, I like secret gardens. I like seeing more every time you go. I like sunshine on a cloudy day. Those are outdoor places. This one is really great. I like things to do with a hangover. And this is the Open Air Museum. If all else fails, try a trip on the tram on the hair of the dog. At the cathedral, pray for some divine intervention. You need some sea air. Or at the art museum, take your mind off how you're feeling. And I mean, this is funny, but the point of it also is that people are coming here for all different reasons, and we can't possibly dictate from top down what those should be. And so looking at other ways for people to find their own threads in, whether it's I need a place where I can go with my 5-year-old, or I need a place where I can go with my parents who are in wheelchairs, or I need a place where I can be inspired, is a really interesting path, I think, towards trip planning. Okay. That's a little tactical, but let's get off the mall. What about people who just want to check out your stuff? When it comes to all the amazing resources you have on the web, and I have spent just a fraction of my life looking at them, and I understand now that I could spend many lifetimes looking at them, and probably would prefer to use my lifetime doing some other things as well. This is an image from TED.com. TED is a conference that features people doing 20-minute talks. How many people have ever watched a TED video? Oh, great. Most people in this room. TED has a really nice way of organizing their content so that you can, yes, there's this fancy thing over here where you can get to individual videos, but you can see that you can choose things by things that were most favorited, things that were rated persuasive or courageous, things that are related to different topics. So if we choose, say, science, and we choose things that were ingenious, how about that? Maybe nothing will happen. But if we go ahead and click on this person, this philosopher comedian talking about science, it'll probably slowly take us to a video of her. And then it'll have on the side other related videos that we might be interested in, and we could really easily surf from what she's going to talk about, and I'm going to pause that so that it doesn't run. Other talks in the same content concept around Creative Spark, related themes, related tags, and I could really easily move through these individual, very specific pieces of content. I think one of the things that's exciting to me about the way the web is happening now is that it's not about a top-down story that you have to linearly move through, but you can dig deep to the things that are of most interest to you. And so that means that it moves away from the one-size-fit-all, dumbing down thing that a lot of us get nervous about, and towards a place where we can really quickly deliver to people the content of most value to them. Now remember all those tweets about this belongs in the Smithsonian? I think people are really ready and interested in having a dialogue with what belongs here. What is a national treasure? This is an exhibit from the Minnesota History Center Museum called MN 150. It was mounted for the sesquicentennial of that state in 2008, and it features 150 things that represent Minnesota. And the exhibit developers couldn't decide what the best way was to pick those things, so they decided to let the public decide. That's inaccurate. They decided to let the public nominate items to be included. They received over 15,000 submissions, and then they arbitrated over which should be on display. And then in the final exhibit, you can see this woman is pictured with the thing that she nominated, and the label actually features her nomination, her paragraph saying why this thing belonged in the exhibit. This has become an exhibit that is a very active place that people come into, and they have arguments about whether this thing belongs or not, what they would include, because they feel closer to the person who made the decision and that it wasn't an entirely black box thing delivered by an expert. And it means that the Minnesota History Center is promoting an environment where people are talking about what is this state about, what is our history about, which I think is a lot of what museums are trying to inspire happening on the floor. People are interested in what you do. This is actually one of my favorite blogs in the museum field, and I'm so glad that it's come back. Is there anybody here from OEC? No? Yes, way in the back. Thank you so much.
I used to be.
You used to be. Excellent. This blog went away, and then just about a month ago it came back after a year hiatus. It's a really great blog about exhibit fabrication, and I think that there are other museums experimenting with this, and it's worthwhile because people are coming to Mecca, because they're prepping with their experience, to think about how they might want to dig deep, not just into the content messages you have, but the question of how all this stuff came to be here. And that becomes something people, I think, are quite interested in afterwards as well, in terms of that whole making of DVD phenomenon. I have several examples on this point, which is about connection to their other platforms. So again, going back to that original 3 columns, where else does the museum connect to in their life? This is an image from the lobby of the Mattress Factory, which is a contemporary art museum in Pittsburgh. And they have this service there put up where you can text message while you're in the museum, and your text message will be shown on these lobby screens. And so you can sort of make comments on the art or send in photos as you're moving through the museum, and they're acknowledged and validated in the museum. Now, this is interesting, but the Mattress Factory is only one small site. It would be a heck of a lot more interesting to imagine this kind of thing as something that's happening as a conversation across lots of different sites, which could certainly happen with something like the Smithsonian. There are a lot of museums playing with emailing stuff home. You can see me wearing an African hairdo in the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam. There are museums experimenting with saving things to your phone. The Smithsonian American Art Museum has ways now where you can make your own collection and save it. There are museums where you can use your ticket to save things that you've made in the museum for later perusal. These generally have about a 10 to 15% revisitation that people actually come back to check out that thing on the web. There's a lower tech version that I'm a little more interested in. This is from the Chicago Children's Museum. They do a program where they're really interested in how documenting your own experience contributes to learning. And so they've been trying lots of different ways to get families and kids to really think about what did I do today at the museum. So they have people actually write letters to themselves about their experience at the museum, and then the museum mails them to you. And well, when you get home, you may not decide to click on that link from your email to go look at the digital collection I made while I was at the museum. Think about how exciting it would be to get home from Washington, D.C. and find a letter in the mail from the Smithsonian reminding you, memorializing your visit. There are learning goals here as well as meaning-making goals. And I think it's really interesting to think about the ways that what people do here can live on and can reverberate in their own lives into the future. One of the most interesting and I think hidden things about the Smithsonian is the extent to which exhibits go out. And, you know, people, when I was prepping for this, people said to me, oh, it would be great if you could talk about how people who can never get to the Smithsonian can connect with their resources. And that person, I acknowledge and validate their question. But there probably is a Smithsonian exhibit, if they're in the States, somewhere within a couple hundred miles of them that they don't know about, that's being put on through sites or through the affiliates. This is from a project, a public art project in Bellevue, Washington, called Sculptural Travel Bugs, where teenagers made sculptures that had geocaching RFID tags associated with them. And then the public art, they decided, if this is public art, it's not going to be here in the art center, we're going to send it out. And so they had these geocaching tags on so that people could take the sculpture, could register where they had found them and where they took them. And you can see this little map of where this little sculpture that's in the bottom right, shown at the aquarium, went all around the Seattle area. Now, I'm not suggesting that artifacts necessarily should go home with people and travel all over in their personal networks, although sometimes that might be nice. But that maybe there's a way to be exposing a little more clearly to people where this artifact has been, where it's going, and to connect people via mapping to things that might be coming to them. Then we have the part where the arrow doesn't work. Okay, this is from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. This is my only Smithsonian example. This is a game called Ghosts of a Chance that was run through the Luce Center. And I just mention it. It's a great project I'm sure you can find out a lot about in many ways. But it's a project that brought together very hardcore gamers on the web, with visitors to the museum, with people who wanted to use their phones and text message in the museum. It engaged in a dialogue about value in terms of what objects belong in a museum and who makes those objects. And I really like how with Ghosts of a Chance, it wasn't one program for one kind of person. It was different kinds of programs, different modules of it worked for different people at different times in the process. Nancy Proctor is here in the room. This is her comment down here. I'm very interested in museums being sites for meetups. If you don't know, Meetup is a phenomenon that is not just managed by this website, but there is this website called meetup.com, and I can type in something like, I'm interested in science, and I can find that there are 88 meetup groups about science near Washington, D.C. So there's a science and skepticism group, there's a science cafe, there's Mystery Science Theater, maybe not as relevant here. But my point is, all these people are meeting up, and the reality is that they're meeting up like these knitters in a coffee shop, or maybe in a bar. And every time I see an image like this, it drives me nuts because these people should not be going to Starbucks to meet. They should be coming to museums. If they love science, they should be thinking, oh, the right place for us for a meetup is a science museum. If they're art enthusiasts, the right place for a meetup is an art museum. I think it wouldn't take much for museums to be able to be welcome and open to those people coming and connecting to the museum's content. Now, I pulled this quote from Nancy that was on my blog when I put up an idea around this, and I just want to read the end of it, which was, but I know many art museum workers would recoil in horror at the idea of being inundated by Sunday painters. I was very disturbed when I saw that, because I'm not an art museum person, but it seems like Sunday painters are your base. They love art. You know, if we aren't creating museums that are right for people who are enthusiastic about our content, whether they make things that we consider of comparable value to what we're showing in the museum or not, then I think we have a problem with who our audience is and how we're supporting them. The last couple of things I think visitors need. This is sort of a good time, bad time kind of example. On the left you see somebody talking, and this has some Twitter speak in it, about visiting a museum called COSI in Columbus. And he's saying that I tweet, so I put out a message about being at COSI with my son. And then the next day I get a message that COSI, the museum, is now following my tweets. And this person is saying that's cool. How Twitter works, you subscribe to people's messages by following them. And so here's sort of the counterexample, which is somebody saying, the Smithsonian stopped following me. Should my feelings be hurt? They kind of are. And when you look at the Smithsonian Twitter feeds, of which there are many, which is fabulous, you can see that a lot of them have lots of followers. So Smithsonian has 6,529 followers, but only follows 42 people. Air and Space has 594 followers, but only follows 9 people. We're using these platforms as more just push-out distribution mechanisms and not necessarily establishing that human connection, which people think is pretty important about these kinds of platforms. This is an example of an institution that I think does this incredibly well, which is the San Francisco Zoo. You can't read any of this, but what's happening is the San Francisco Zoo is above in green. The other one is a guy named Chris in blue. Basically what happened was this. Chris posted a link. He said, here are pics of Tallulah and friends from their home at the San Francisco Zoo. And it's a link to these images on Flickr, of these really great images of these chimpanzees. And then the zoo picked that up and they said, check out these beautiful pictures from Chris Michel, and linked to it as well. And then Chris wrote, and then he said, we hope you enjoyed your visit. Thanks for coming. And then Chris wrote, San Francisco Zoo, I absolutely loved it. What a place. Thanks for being so hospitable. So here's a conversation happening between these two people where the zoo is being aware of what people are putting out there, the photographs they're taking at the zoo, and is acknowledging and validating, saying, great job, these are awesome, and rebroadcasting them to the world. This whole conversation happens in public, as, by the way, do these conversations. So people know and have reverberations of this that are greater than just if somebody had emailed the zoo and said, hey, I took these pictures while I was here. The final version of this, which relates to that, I thought this was just hilarious. Anybody who's worked in a museum education department has gotten these loathsome emails from 6th graders who seem not to be able to operate an encyclopedia or type things into Google and sort of want to ask you all kinds of questions about your topic. And seeing this may, invoke some of that fear and trepidation in our hearts. But of all the Smithsonian-related Twitter messages I've seen in the last 2 weeks, this is the only one of this type. It would not hurt anybody to write 140 characters back to this person. And as I said before, it's happening all in public. And so the fact that this plea for information is going out into the public ether and nobody's saying, hey, I'm from the Smithsonian and I can help you, and making that magical connection, it's an opportunity that I think we're not very far from being able to do. Okay. Visitors have a lot of needs. But what about the Smithsonian? What about what you want to do and the places and things you want to support? Going back to those squiggles, I really feel like this is the core question, which is what kind of relationship do you want to have with visitors? And this is actually a very personal question, because there are some people who are not comfortable putting themselves out there and wanting, for example, to have their name out there on a Twitter feed or on a blog, or even go out down in the museum and talk to people. And I think that's valid. That's okay if that's not the kind of person you are. But you need to figure out, am I a person who wants to share things with people? Am I a person who wants to listen to people? And what kind of relationship you see that in your head working as for you? This is a picture I took from this week's New Yorker. The king is saying, I want to be feared as a tyrant, loved as a father, and revered as a god, but I also want them to think I'm funny. This is a problem a lot of museums have. We want to be everybody to our visitors. And I think that the more we can feel confident about what we are and what we aren't and the relationship that we're willing to have, the more we can avoid this king's problem. And so I think that from an institutional perspective, the thing you need to be able to do this successfully is you need a mission against which you can evaluate and prioritize what relationships are going to be appropriate. And I admit that I got a little concerned looking at this mission statement on the Smithsonian website, because I don't know if the words increase and diffuse knowledge are enough to really, for you to be able to decide, is this the right thing to do? Is this the right relationship to have? And I am really interested in this idea of having actionable missions. The reason I'm interested in it because being on mission is the only way that a lot of museums really can decide what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. That's not exactly true. There's also the revenue and business side. But a lot of times new things are sort of cast out of hand because they're not on mission. Well, I'm sorry, but it's very hard for me to look at this mission and to decide what is or isn't on mission. And frankly, if increase and diffusion of knowledge is the thing that the Smithsonian is about, I mean, when you look at something like the web, it's incredible to imagine how on mission and on target that is compared potentially to other things that might happen here. And I think often we use the words on mission, if we don't have an actionable mission statement, to sort of mean the things we've already been doing, which we already feel comfortable being on mission even if we can't evaluate them, versus saying this new thing which we might need to actually evaluate in some way. And so I want to give an example that I think, for me at least, is clearer than this, which is the mission of this museum. This is the mission I found on your website. Michael confirmed that, yes, it is the one on the website. And so whether this resonates with you as the mission that you use or not, this is the one I started from here. So I sort of separated it into these three chunks about what you do, what the content is, and what sort of the tactics or distribution platforms are. And so when I look at this, I start having some questions. And the first are around the words curiosity and discovery. Because when I think of being curious or discovering things, I think of unsolved secrets, and I think of mysterious corners. I think of things that aren't fully lit for me to just know everything about it, but things that are really available for me to dig into and be surprised by. And so I'm really curious, what's special about these three outcomes? Curiosity, discovery, and learning. How would you evaluate whether something was inspiring those three things as opposed to other things that might be of interest to you? The second part of this I wonder about is who the intended audience is. It says we inspire curiosity, discovery, and learning about nature and culture, and there's no sense of in whom. I've been doing some work recently with the Canadian Science and Technology Museum. It's a national museum. They're working on their new strategic plan and mission. And we had this discussion last time about whether they're a museum for Canadians or about Canada or how it relates to their national agenda. And the topic of the Smithsonian came up in the question of, is the Smithsonian for Americans? Which is sort of an interesting question, and I was surprised actually not to see any of that kind of language about intended audience anywhere I looked across Smithsonian content. Then I look at these two content pieces, nature and culture, and I think, okay, what is included in nature and culture, and what is excluded? What could you decide is not germane in thinking about this as an actionable mission statement? And then finally, looking at these four distribution tactics, I wonder, okay, how do these programs, research, collections, exhibitions, and education, relate to inspiring curiosity, discovery, and learning? Like, where do you draw the exact line? And then I also wonder, are these the only ones? And where might web or where might things like gaming come in? Would they be supports for these four? Would they be additional ones? How would you decide what is considered to be a research experience that inspires curiosity or an education experience that inspires discovery about culture? And really think about it in terms of evaluating, is this thing hitting our mission? I know I just put up a whole lot of questions here. I want to give you 3 examples of ways and programs that are out there that I think might be germane to this kind of mission. The first one actually does not relate to nature and culture necessarily. The person who runs it, David Clevon, is in the room. He's sitting here in the second row if you want to talk to him later. It's a really great project. It's a research platform for discovery and learning. And what it is the Holocaust Museum has an artifact, which is an album of handwritten signatures by children from the Lodz ghetto. They don't know what happened to all 15,000 of these children, and so they created this online research platform where visitors can basically sign up to do the research in real history databases to find out and try and find out what happened to these children. And they're still in beta and they're working with school groups, but just a couple of comments that have come from people using it. What we found most engaging about this project was the possibility of discovering the undiscovered. Pretty clear check on the inspiring discovery. And then this second one, the more we learned of individual victims, the more capable we were of understanding the magnitude of the Holocaust. That this opportunity to do research, to connect through the Holocaust Museum to other students who are also doing the research, to artifacts, to databases, allows people to do this learning and to be inspired discoverers and learners. My second example has to do with the tactic or the distribution model around collections and looking at curiosity about nature. These images are from a program called the Nature Exchange, which is led by Science North in Canada, but is now in a few science centers. And here's how Nature Exchange works. A kid finds something in nature, brings it to the Science Museum, a staff member talks with them about the thing that they brought, and they get to exchange it for something else that some other kid has brought at some time. So you bring in your rock, you get the stick. And it's more cool than the stick, I think. Alan Nursel, who created this program or led the creation, says the best thing about the Nature Exchange is that most of the real learning takes place outside of the center where our visitors actually live their lives. Kids and adults too get involved in actively observing, collecting, and studying the world around them. Science North, through the Nature Exchange, provides the venue that brings them together, the platform that connects people's real lives, their own platforms outside in the world, through the museum, to have an experience that provides context and feedback and is an outstanding tool for encouraging scientific behavior in everyday life. So it's not just that you're bringing your stick and you're getting your rock, it's that that experience is inculcated with the values of the Science Center, with real science learning, and then takes you back out into your real life. My last example, looking again at the Natural History Mission, is an educational programming platform for curiosity about culture. This is a program called Living Library. It came out of the youth festivals in Europe, and it's now been spreading around the world and a little bit in the States. And here's how it works. You show up at this library, which is created at a festival or something like that, or in a museum or a library, and they have a catalog, and the books in the catalog are people who represent various prejudices. So quadriplegic, gay cop, male nanny, Native American, and you check out a book, which means that you're going to sit down with that person and dialogue for half an hour or so. What I really like about this program, again, it's a platform that mediates interactions between people, and it uses the value system of the library context, a context that we think of as being about learning, about connecting to new and potentially foreign ideas, and uses that as a way to elevate and support interactions that wouldn't otherwise happen. And when I think about what we would like to happen when people go through an experience with a foreign culture in an exhibit, this kind of platform bringing people together strikes me as a very powerful way to make that curiosity thing happen. So I want to wrap up the talking part with a few recommendations that are maybe institutional, maybe personal, and I encourage you to think of them in both ways. The first is to define and prioritize your audiences. Another thing that was on David Allison's in and out list. Oh, what's out? Boomers and their issues. What's in? Millennials and their issues. Okay, that's an audience situation. I get a little concerned. This is my dad in the lower left with his computer, and I get a little concerned because there are a lot of boomers who are, retiring, and they still have their issues. But certainly there are plenty of millennials as well who may want to be part of the museum experience, who you may want to reach out to. And so I think that you need to decide very personally, am I interested in kids in a classroom across the country? Am I interested in a young woman who's a DC local? Am I interested in all the tourists who are coming through? Am I interested in a virtual group of people? Am I interested in Nina's dad? And I think there is certainly an institutional component to this, which is that if the institution can define and prioritize audiences, it'll help you in creating what your overall web strategy is, what your overall messaging is. But I think also very personally, each of us can decide, here's the kind of visitor I'm interested in. And then you take that interest and listen. I met a curator recently from the Netherlands, this woman named Mariam, who's very excited about Web 2.0 and social web. And I asked her why, and she said, well, I manage a collection at this museum that is very undervisited. It was Middle Eastern artifacts. And she said, I know that on the web there are people who love Berber art and who are so interested in it, are discussing it, and that is the audience who I am interested in sharing with my expertise and what happens here at the museum. Yes, I want them to come to the museum, but I want to find them, I want to listen to them, and I want to connect with them. This is an image from a tool called howsociable.com, where you can type in something like I've typed in Smithsonian, and you could click through directly and find the 6,200 links on Delicious associated with Smithsonian, or the 175,000 Flickr photographs associated with Smithsonian. And there are a lot of these sites that can help you listen so that you don't have to be constantly going out and hunting and pecking and finding out what people are saying, not just about your institution, but maybe about a particular program, a particular type of content that you particularly are interested in, and really find out, what are people saying, what are people wishing they could do, what do people have, what do they don't have available to them. And then find a way to connect to it. This is an image from a blog in the Adirondacks. There's a small natural history center there called the Wild Center. And this blogger, who is not associated with the Wild Center, is saying, 2 years ago I was lamenting that no public leaders were stepping up to the plate on trying to understand what global climate change would mean for the Adirondacks. Thankfully, that has changed. The Wild Center in Tupper Lake has taken on the lead role of informing their neighbors about the potential impacts of global warming, showing local builders what they can do to mitigate those effects, and organizing scientific meetings to discuss and assess the progress of climate change in the Adirondacks. So the Wild Center realized that their audience of interest, local businesses, local people in the Adirondacks, were expressing an interest and a need around knowing what to do and how they might relate to climate change. They connected it to something that they could do and something they were really about, which is about stewardship and conservation messages related to the Adirondacks, and provided something that this person at least felt was right on target in terms of being of value. Yes, this happened on an institutional level, but it can also really happen on a personal level. If your audience is desperate 7th graders who need help learning about the Air and Space Museum, boy, you could respond to that Twitter message so quickly and be connecting it on mission to something you can provide. And then the last thing I'd say, which in some ways I know is the hardest one, is just to jump in. On the left, this is an image from the Exploratorium, which is a pretty experimental place, a science center, and they've been experimenting with these staff pick images where there's signage up basically that says this is something that staff really love. And it's just a really simple way for them to experiment with educators and curators expressing their ardor and passion for certain exhibits in a way that they can communicate it with guests. On the right is an image from a blog that just got started at the Denver Art Museum. I want to show it to you. This woman named Sonnet Hansen, she's an educator at the Denver Art Museum. She was very nervous about starting this blog, but she felt like for this particular audience, which was young adults in the Denver area coming to their programming, this is what they needed, and so she was going to do it. And so I'm just going to show you, this was her first post. This is an image of something, an artifact in their collection, which is this sculpture of this doll with all of her toys that she has thrown out of her crib. It's called Pris, which is the name of the doll. Sonnet says, when Pris came back out of art storage recently and we prepped her for install, here's what we found. And you can see there's an image of a tattoo of a trout on this doll, on this porcelain doll. Now notice that you cannot in any way see that tattoo when you see this exhibit on display. And so Sonnet talks about how the artist hides tattoos on her porcelain dolls because she thought it was a good idea, and talking about that inside jokeness. And so I think this is a really nice way, an example of showing that behind the scenes thing, explaining and sharing the passion we feel for the work we do. But I'm not going to suggest that this is always so easy. You know, Sonnet, in the very end of her post, she says, you know, in this blog, I'm hoping to share some of these delightful surprises with you. She says about how often she's going to post. And then she says, and now the part I don't love so much, sharing a bit about me, Sonnet Hansen. And she talks a little bit about her discomfort with putting herself out in this public space. She's really honest about it, and she's just saying, you know what? This is outside of my comfort zone as a museum educator. This is not what I'm familiar with doing. But I've realized that I have this defined audience. I know what they want, and I know that this is something I can give them. And so she decided to jump in. And I'm really proud of her and every museum person who is willing to do that, you know, to put yourself out there and listen to what people want and give them something back. Just a quick thought on this increase and diffuse. I've heard that one of the things I've learned from the Smithsonian New Media Strategy wiki is that there's a real interest in promoting education at the Smithsonian these days. And I've always liked this fact that the word education comes from the Greek word adduce, which means to draw out or to pull from. And I think that if you think about that, adducing, pulling from people, diffusing, sending back out through their platforms and their networks, it really has that nice image of that platform and how people might connect with each other through a place like the Smithsonian in it. And so I am so excited to think about with you and hear from you the ways that you hope to adduce from your visitors and the ways you help to diffuse and share with them. And so I hope you'll stay for a discussion. And thanks. And so I guess we'll take questions now, and then if you're watching this on the web, if you want to send a question to @NinaK.Simon on Twitter, I'm going to try and monitor those a little bit too. So I guess for people who have questions, I guess if you could just stand up where you are, that would be great, and if you could introduce yourself, that would be great too. Yes, Nancy. Hacker spaces, yeah. all of this image of art museums being a place you could go and see somebody who might have set up an easel and be sketching or painting in front of a piece of art. To me, that's a very romantic image that I've never actually seen materialized. And I don't know if the rules have changed or if it's too hard or if fewer people do that kind of thing these days. But it seems to me that making space for people to do art in art museums is a great way to move in that direction. And you know, you're right. I'm really interested in this question of why, when you walk in a science museum, does the message to you say, you can do science, science is everywhere, you can be part of it. Whereas in an art museum, and even sometimes history museums, it's more about, you can look at art, you can appreciate history, you can learn about it. And I think that looking for ways to invite people to really be active participants in their experience and in the experience of something like art or history makes a lot of sense. I wish I had a golden answer for you, but you know, I mean, I think giving people some paint might be a good start. Yes.
Positive way, but my question is, should we worry in the game of telephone about scientific accuracy or cultural appropriateness?
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, I often wonder, you know, I was thinking about this as I was prepping, did Mario know the right thing about the giant squid? Recently, an art educator from SF MoMA, Julie Charles, showed some statistics I was looking for desperately before this, but wasn't able to find, showing that people remember 10 times as much the things they say versus the things they hear, and that of the things that they hear that they remember, they misremember about 80% of that. So people are already making these kinds of fallacious things all the time. If you ever watch parents and kids walking around a museum, I'm sure you'll hear all kinds of crazy things parents tell their kids that aren't true. I think what becomes nerve-wracking for us is when it's on what we perceive as a more public platform like the web. And so whereas a dad saying the wrong thing to his son only impacts their knowledge and maybe the few people standing around them, we have this different feeling about what happens on the web. So I guess that is partially to say people are already saying and hearing the wrong thing. So then the question is, well, how do we deal with that? You know, do we want to move towards a path of intervening, or do we want to find ways to be part of that conversation? I guess I feel like, you know, listening in some ways is the first step to even getting a sense of what's being said. And then I really am interested in this question of how does a museum use its values and the things that are important to you to find a way to intervene in that conversation in a way that brings knowledge. I think one of the most interesting examples of this is the Science Buzz website, which is run by the Science Museum of Minnesota, and it is a community blog about science. They put up content very quickly about science, what's going on, and some of it's, you know, a little silly, but let's see. Oh, this has 0 comments. That's not what we want. They get a whole lot of comments on this blog, clearly not on these two that I have. Well, we can look at this recent comments. Okay, in the event of a flu pandemic, would you be willing to avoid public transportation? One of the things that they do here is that they're really careful, and this is poor because this is a poll. I'm sorry, I should have found something if I wanted to show it to you. They do a really interesting job of intervening and being part of the conversation that happens in comments. And there's actually a study going on right now at Michigan State around how this blog promotes science learning and how the opportunities for them to sort of change or shift the conversation are or aren't working in that comment stream. I should say there have been some examples out there, often related to things like racial attitudes, and certainly I would recommend talking to the folks at the Holocaust Museum about how they've managed their very active web forums. And I think that their attitude has been, we want to be the place where people are having the misconceptions and discussing them because we want to be part of that conversation. It's sort of like the parent who would rather their kid came to talk to them about drugs than just do it on their own. So I think it's time for us to honestly confront what we can listen to now and then decide, okay, what do we want our part in that to be? Okay, I'm going to unrudely look at the comments that may or may not have come in over the web, so I'm not please, Bill has a microphone too, if you would like to ask a question. Oh, and I'm supposed to repeat the questions. I'm so sorry, web people.
Okay, I have a question.
Great.
It's Elizabeth.
Yes.
Here, and I'm glad you used us as an example and made me realize our mission statement needs some work. You talked about, this is the hardest for me to get my mind around, maybe because of how I perhaps use the web as much, but listening to what they need. You just threw up like about 50 different sites to look at. I mean, how's a methodical way to kind of go about some of that research or understanding? Or maybe I'm not asking the question right. I just feel slightly overwhelmed. I get defining and prioritizing audiences, but
sure,
trying to figure out what they need, it just seems so vast, and everything's an option. So
yeah, definitely. Well, so let me show you this quick. Okay, I think this will actually be the best way to do this. So, for example, let's say we wanted to look at, and Twitter is used by a small number of people and mostly adults in this country right now, but it is a great search opportunity because everything happens at such a quick, short level. So I can do something like start an advanced search, where I can say, okay, I'm interested in Smithsonian, and let's say that I'm interested only really of people who are pretty local here, let's say within 50 miles of Washington, D.C. And very quickly I'll get this search, these results for what people are saying about the Smithsonian pretty nearby. And so I can pretty quickly look through this and say, okay, here are some people talking about following the Smithsonian. Oh, here are some people who are here, who are talking about this talk, blah, 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 talking about this talk, blah, 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 blah. These people don't have a lot of needs right now. But I guess, I think that, do you think we should become the first sand sculpture Smithsonian? No clue what that one means. I guess, I think that looking at this kind of thing and having that kind of feed going, you can start to, for example, set some filters around, okay, what are tourists talking about versus what are students talking about versus what are teachers talking about. I think that it does help to be audience specific when you're thinking about these things. It helps you filter in terms of the listening, but it also helps you filter in terms of which needs are germane to me. Asking people what they need actually doesn't require any of these tools. You could always just walk outside and do it, right? And so I think that being in an environment, we're so used to being in a learning environment. We're always reading articles, whether it's about kinds of educational opportunities or things like that. I think that working this kind of listening or learning into the learning that you're already doing, looking at links and things like that in your work, is just a way to start getting that human pulse on what you do. And so I think it can be very overwhelming. One thing that a lot of museums and corporations have been doing, which I really recommend, is setting up little listening groups and maybe setting up, often it comes from a PR or marketing side originally, but occasionally also there'll be some person who is interested and comfortable in this space who will be willing to do a lunch chat with other people from the museum. I've worked with some museums where they have a pretty formal process where, for example, a curator can come to a specific person and say, I have this great collection that is not going out. What is another way for me to do outreach with this that is not an exhibit and not a program? And there's an outreach technology person who can help them sort of imagine, okay, how often could you take care of this thing? Who is it for? And having that dialogue in a pretty directed design way to decide where you want to go with it. So I guess when it comes to listening, picking the people who you're interested in, finding out where they are on the places like the web, or asking them outside, where they are or what their interests are, is a place to start. And then just for a while, it will be overwhelming, and there's a stream to just get used to, I think, in some ways, in the same way that if you never read the New York Times and then somebody plunked it on your desk, it would feel pretty overwhelming as well, but you learn to read the sections that are germane to you. Yes, in the back. Feed for this query. Right.
And online, someone, A. Gardina, wants to know, for organizations as large as the Smithsonian, what recommendation do you have for making the most of limited resources?
For organizations as large as the Smithsonian, not as large as the Smithsonian. Well, I think that even here at the Smithsonian, probably people feel like they have limited resources, or their resources are limited in a different way. This is pretty rare for me. I had to do a lot of thinking to put together what I wanted to talk with you guys about, because I usually work with much smaller museums with much more limited resources. A lot of this stuff is free. It just takes a lot of time. And so I think that it's not really a dollars situation as much as it is about comfort, particularly things you can do in the museum. So, for example, you could set up something online where people could make comments. Or you can put out a comment book and Post-its and let people write things up and share things in the museum. I've worked with a lot of museums that are more willing to spend the pain to do something that is brand new for them in technology than to put Post-its out on the floor. And so I think that any museum, is particularly that's why I like this relationship question. So if what you say is, we want to hear from visitors, we want to know what they care about related to climate change or related to freedom, then you should feel comfortable going out on the floor of a museum and asking people that question. I'm really interested in the question kind of opportunities to have museums be asking and inviting people to share their answers to questions. And I feel strongly that if you ask 10 people the question and you are bored to tears either by that experience or by the answers, then you have the wrong question. And so I think that it doesn't take resources. It takes a real comfort to have a new relationship with visitors, and there are lots of different relationships available. And frankly, I think it's in many cases the museums that aren't as federally managed and looked at as momentous as as these Smithsonian museums are, that have a lot more flexibility in some ways to experiment in these ways. Yes, you're pointing.
Same other thing online.
Okay.
It's tough for you to keep switching back and forth. Sorry. Patrick GMJ was saying that he forgot to tag it. What do you think museums and universities should learn from each other about this stuff?
From what?
From each other.
From each other. Well, originally there was a number 5 here that says, tell each other about it. And I do feel strongly that you should find venues to talk to people about this stuff. There is a Ning site called Museum 3.0, and I'm happy to help find or get you the link, or Linda Kelly, who I guess is probably asleep because she's in Australia, can get you the link for that community of people who are talking about this stuff. There are some different venues out there where people are talking about these things. I think we need to do a lot of sharing. I think we also have to be really comfortable talking about risk and talking about small experiments that don't work. I am a fan of giving gifts to people who express and share their failures. I think it's one of the hardest things for us professionally to feel comfortable doing. And so I think that finding ways, especially when you're across huge institutions, it's so easy to feel lost or feel like you're only able to do a little bit. And so being able to have a working group, whether it's that you meet for lunch or that you meet online, is a really great way to make that kind of thing happen. And it's interesting, I actually at some point, so I run this blog called Museum 2.0, and it has about 16,000 weekly readers, and at one point I really wanted to invite people to participate more, and I put up this survey to let people vote on how they'd like to participate more, and very few people expressed interest in some kind of community space to share what they were doing, and so we didn't do that. And so I think that making a time in your day for reflection on what you're doing and for sharing it with other people. I often say that for me, blogging is learning in a public space. And it is a time for me to think, and it is a time for me to write about what I'm thinking, which happens to be a medium that works for me. And it just happens to happen in a public space, and I get a lot of value back from that. I think we need way, way more blogs in the museum professional environment, way more people who are experimenting and doing it in a way publicly to learn from others and to share with them. Yes, Bill.
I have my hand up, but I also have the microphone, so I guess
that works really well.
Yeah, sort of also advertising that the microphone is here, so when you raise your hand, just give me a minute to get over to you. But my question has to do with that kind of that community idea. So one of the things that sort of comes up in my mind and in conversations that I have is, wouldn't it be great if we could have people, a lot of times the words that are used, and I use them myself, extend the experience beyond what they do here. Like, sure. Oh, you've done something here, and then you can go back when you're at home, email yourself a collection, and then see what other people are saying about it. But I guess my question is, do people really want to do that? I mean, I find it kind of difficult to keep up with my Facebook page and a Twitter, feed, and I have my Google Reader that I use, but I'll check it like once every 3 weeks. So am I really going to go home and see what other people have said about the giant squid? I mean, in your experience, what's the audience for that? Do people really, are those communities out there waiting to happen? Or would that be, like you discovered, not a good direction to go?
Yeah, okay, so the question is about, do visitors really want to connect back with this kind of content and with each other when they get home? It's interesting, when you go on a trip and you take photographs, why do you do it? Do you take photographs so that later you're going to look at them and you're going to relive the experience? Sometimes. Sometimes you take a photograph just because you're in front of this thing and you're inspired, but as soon as you see that photograph later, you're just going to delete it or forget about it. I'm often interested watching museum visitors take photographs and wondering, what are they going to do with that photograph? Are they going to send it to somebody? Is it about the social experience? So one part of this is thinking about motivation to do the thing in the first place. And then sometimes I feel like when we create trivial opportunities for people to make a collection of things while they're at the museum, if it's not important to them, then of course they're not going to check it out later. It was sort of a fun activity that occupied their time while they were there. It wasn't something that they necessarily want to memorialize in a way they're going to keep up with it later. Then again, when we take those photographs on trips, sometimes we don't know which times we're doing it to memorialize and capture an experience and which times we're going to throw it away. So I think that there also is a crapshoot element to this. I think actually that 10 to 15% of people checking those things out is pretty good when you think about the percentage of people who might remember or continue to talk about what they learned at the museum or the experience they had once they walk out the door. However, another whole side to this is about the meaningfulness of the transaction. I'm very interested in gifting culture. There's a lot of people talking on the web about how social interactions happen on the web, what makes them useful. And there's this guy, Yuri Engstrom, this sociologist who talks about social objects, and he says that social objects are objects that you give as gifts. And so if I send you a photograph of me with the giant squid, you have a different relationship to it than if it was just randomly up there or if you were able to pull it down or something like that. And I think it's pretty useful to imagine how can it not just be institution gives me something, I go home, and it's just this personal thing, but something that has a gift element component. So, for example, if while in the museum I was encouraged not to email something home to myself, but find something in this gallery to take a picture of and send to your mom or send to a friend, how would I approach that task differently? And how would the person who receives that approach what they've received differently? I think it also, from a marketing perspective, is pretty positive if we can get people talking to each other through our stuff instead of just experiencing it by themselves. And so, from a design perspective, I think there's a whole world of things we haven't explored in terms of what that extending the visit experience looks like, and one of those is just around something like social gifting. But I think there are a lot of places we can go in terms of thinking about how do we make that meaningful, how do we make it a memorial that people are interested in continuing to have later. Yes, Mark.
Both of my kids recently got phones which allow them to text their friends, and so anytime that they're texting content that isn't nonsense to their friends is valuable time. We went into Air and Space a couple of weeks ago and they had the ability to text questions. And when they saw that in front of Amelia Earhart's plain, as we walked through the exhibits, they were texting questions left and right rather than texting each other standing next to one another. You're ugly, you suck. They were actually texting questions and getting answers. So any interaction that they do that causes them to think more about the content in front of them, taking a picture of it they'll never look at again. Sure. The fact that they compose that picture and assign value to it at that moment is extra attention that we would not have gotten otherwise.
Mm-hmm. The Chicago Children's Museum is doing a lot of experimenting with that. They're not just doing that, write a letter home to yourself. They actually do some exhibits that automatically take photographs of you as you're, say, building a construction thing with your family, and then later you sort of make a little digital book out of the pictures of you having done it. And they're really looking at it from the perspective of children learning to have recall and outside perspective on what they've done, and certainly having that moment even of reflection of, yes, now I'm going to take a picture of this, this matters in some way, is an on-site immediate experience that might be valuable. I noticed that there is an online question which is, how do you deal with coworkers in museums who think social media is just a fad, joke, or waste of time? There are a lot of things in museums that may be fads, jokes, or wastes of time. I think there are probably some people in museums who think that managing large collections that visitors never see may be just a very long fad, joke, or waste of time. And there are other people for whom that is the backbone of what museums are about. And so I really think of social media in an and perspective. I come from an exhibit development, exhibit design background, and I feel like I often say I'm a very greedy exhibit designer. You know, I want to look at the whole world, take the best stuff, steal it, and put it into museums to make them better. And so I feel like social media is just another one of those design toolkits that we can steal from to make museums better. And so I think a lot of times when it comes to incorporating something new, whether it's social media, whether it's touch screens, you know, who thought that putting screens in museums or having flip things was going to be a fad, joke, or waste of time? Some people still do think that having buttons in museums is not a good idea. But for others, it's part of how their learning style relates to the museum. And I think that we always have known that people visit museums socially. You know, they're coming in groups. We've always said in our missions, we are town squares. We are places for communities to congregate. And so I feel like looking at social media, which is so successful at hitting those kinds of things, is where we can really accommodate some of those mission goals and also some of what visitors are already bringing with them to the museum in that way.
I had a question.
Yes.
Hi, sorry for my voice. Hi, Vicki Portway, Air and Space Museum. Thanks, Mark. Now I know where all those rapid-fire questions were coming from. Did they ask about the rubber chicken? Okay, good. I'm half done with a page on the wiki about that whole experiment. Thank you, Nancy. So, see, your lecture is a social experience. Anyway, I just listening to you talk, a couple of things came to mind. One, about your most recent comments, metrics in an institution that is so heavily focused on metrics and reporting and so forth and measuring success. How do we communicate that this type of thing is very hard to measure and needs to be evolving and changing as things change, not only technology-wise, but also for the visitors? So how do we kind of be agile in that environment, yet satisfy our reporting structure? Where do you see that going?
Does anybody here know how to measure whether you have inspired curiosity, discovery, and learning?
Thank you, that's where I was going.
I think that we already have an incredibly hard job measuring what we actually say our missions are about. And what we are good at measuring, whether it's on the web or in the museum, is how many people show up, sometimes in some ways where they go, what breaks because they use it a lot. The things that we learn from measuring are not necessarily related to the things that are what our mission is about. And so I think first of all we need to think about what are the evaluation metrics that actually matter to what this place is about. And I think that that's just as hard to solve about exhibits or about collections or research as it is to solve about web. And so I really feel like that is an important part. And then in other ways, you know, with the web, metrics are a blessing and a curse. You know, the first time you show somebody a Google Analytics site where they can see all the pages that were clicked on, suddenly they get thrilled about the idea of knowing the numbers related to every single thing, and it becomes very reductive. On the other hand, those metrics are fabulous. They're things we don't have. If you walk out here into natural history, we don't have any automatic way to know what people are looking at, how long they're spending at these things, and that kind of thing. So I think that on the one hand, we have lots of metrics we can use when it comes to things like web. If you're talking about this question, which always comes up, how do you trace web visitation to physical visitation, or to tickets sold, which you don't even sell tickets here, or you sell tickets to the IMAX, but I don't think there's too much worry about selling tickets to the IMAX. I think that then you do have a problem, but it's then going back and saying, well, why is that the evaluative goal around this? And so that again comes back somewhat to this defining audiences, because if the Smithsonian's audience is a national audience, then those people have needs too. And those people don't necessarily have to physically visit to be accommodated as an audience. I think it's really a question of determining evaluation metrics that relate to your actual mission. And while it may be unpleasant to bring this up with people who feel that the metrics already accommodate their needs, I doubt that the number of people through the door really relates to a lot of the missions of a lot of the museums here or really anywhere. Yes.
Thanks. Dennis Hash from Natural History. Aside from things like Flutter, and thank you, Jeff, for passing along that gem, what sort of technologies do you see on the horizon, since you live, breathe, and drink this stuff maybe more than most of us? So what new technologies do you see coming down that would be in this area?
I live in the woods, but I live off the grid. But no, I understand what you're asking. Well, you know, certainly when it comes to teens and to global audiences, mobile is really where a lot of the action is. Certainly when it comes to teens, you know, email is just where they get spam. Their experience around connecting with people is on social networks, so there is that aspect. I am interested in whether the Smithsonian is focused on a global audience or a national audience and how that relates to what technologies you might pursue. Certainly everywhere else in the world, the number one way to connect with the web, sorry, not everywhere else in the world, everywhere but Western Europe in here, is through your phone. And so the extent to which that content is servable in a mobile way, I think, is interesting. And by 2012, I think 50% of Americans will have smartphones, so they'll be able to serve media and web content on their phones on demand. I think, you know, people talk about semantic web and they talk about virtual worlds. I think that both of these things are coming slowly. There's an interesting dynamic between technologies that are coming up through kids versus technologies that are coming down through adults. And so I think that's an audience question of whether you want to be with phones, which may be more about kids, or something like semantic web, which may be coming down more through researchers and adults. And so I think that becomes an audience question as well. Yes, Mark. Question from the web.
Yes. Somebody on Ustream. It is Ron J. Miller. The question was, talk about museums sharing communal spaces versus individual museum sites, I guess like the British site you talked about earlier.
Okay, museums sharing spaces. Well, I think there are physical elements to this too, but certainly on the web, I mean, maybe this is one of the ways that the Smithsonian has the greatest potential compared to other museums, because you already have all these museums, and they already at least sort of share a site. I think it's incredibly, incredibly hard for museums to agree to share sites. There's a great game called Wolf Quest created by the Minnesota Zoo, and they were really careful in how they developed it to not be heavily branded with their zoo, so that it could really be something that other zoos could sign on to and feel good about being part of. You know, branding and message always becomes an issue with that kind of thing. Actually, the reason that I Like Museums website exists is because all those museums are too darn small to have their own marketing thing at all, and so they finally, out of scarcity, decided, okay, this is the only way we can do this. So I think that, unfortunately, the way that usually ends up happening is through desperation. That said, there are really great collaborations that are starting to happen between libraries and museums. I love the story of COSI Columbus, a science center that was too big for its own space, and so started finding strategic partners to lease to, like the local public broadcasting company, station. So now when you go to the science center, It is a science center, it's a radio station, it's a TV station, and it becomes a place that from a political standpoint is much more appealing because they have a broadcast arm as well as a museum arm, but then also from a visitor perspective is appealing. The Smithsonian obviously has that, and I think one of the hardest challenges is figuring out how to balance a goal to have some kind of centralized experience versus all of the great things that can happen if you let every institution do its own thing. And so I think particularly here, when it comes to things like trip planning, nobody is visiting just one Smithsonian, and so, or maybe locals are, but nobody who's planning a trip to DC is doing so, and that seems like an obvious place to feel comfortable starting, and I know Go Smithsonian is sort of a step in that direction. Yes, Michael.
This is a relatively, I hope this isn't convoluted, but I guess my question comes up from what Mark was saying and an article that was in Museum recently about gaming and the fact that gaming provides people with a really clear sense of what they're supposed to do. And I'm thinking of the Sprint commercial where the family is wandering through the museum and talking, the commercial talks about their 3G networks and using their phones the way they want to. I wonder, in a lot of ways, what it is that we expect our visitors to do when they're here, and what ways we can communicate more effectively with them about our expectations for them, provide them with different kinds of activities which might actually be more in line with their needs, and also how we develop those activities in a way that reflects our values. And I'm just wondering about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think telling people what to do is great. I think it makes them comfortable. I think it makes them feel like they know how to be successful. On the other hand, we often get concerned that it's reductive in terms of what the creative experience or opportunity is for them. I also actually feel very strongly that constraining people is great. Giving people something and requiring them to pick one thing in the room that they're going to focus on as opposed to checking out everything, I think promotes deep experiences. I'm very interested in gaming and have done some museum games. Certainly that's what I was doing at the Spy Museum. And I'm interested in the ways that role-playing becomes an opportunity for people to dig deeper and to ask questions they wouldn't otherwise ask. There's a game called SF0. And SF0 is a game that you play in real life where you go out and you do stuff like explore greatness in art. Oh, what a perfect one for us to check out. So purchase the instructions for this game. Purchase or create replicas of the greatest work of art in the history of humanity. I have no idea what that means. What they do in this game is they invite you to do these challenges. The guys who created the game, I asked them once what a favorite challenge was, and this guy said, distract the mailman. These are challenges that are not very prescriptive in terms of what you're supposed to do. And one of the things I love about this game is that they say, in the about, they say, creating a new character. What does it mean to create a new character in SF0? Your character looks exactly the same as you. Your character will have all the same skills and attributes as you and even the same memories and feeling. Isn't my character just, well, me? Good question. Your character has several important things that you do not have. First, your character has a score. Its score is a barometer of its progress. You may find that your willingness to interact with the city in new ways varies linearly with relation to your score. And then it says, finally, last and most importantly, your character is able to do things that you may be unable or unwilling to do yourself. And so the point here is that you may not be able to distract the mailman, Michael Mason. You may feel that that is an uncomfortable or an unsavory thing to do. But if you are going to get points for doing it, your character will do it. And so, this sounds kind of silly, but I think that in the context of a museum, and I think certainly with Ghosts of a Chance, where the Smithsonian American Art Museum is asking people to do all kinds of silly things and giving them instructions via their phone on what to do, people find themselves putting themselves in situations they never would otherwise and really exploring a new range of what's possible. So I like instructions. I like that when I play chess, I know what the rules are. I don't feel limited by them. I feel like I have a lot of creative opportunities within that, but I know that that is the board on which I'm playing. I think particularly for museum visitors, we talk about people with threshold fear, people who feel like they don't know what they're supposed to do in a museum, or it's an uncomfortable space for them. I think giving them some rules or some challenges to play against helps them understand how to be successful in the context of a museum experience. In some ways, VTS, the tactic that some art museums play with around how to look at an art piece, are a set of rules that functionally become a kind of not super fun, but a game that helps you dig into art in a new way.
Nina, I wanted to ask you about the site you showed earlier. Was it the Science Museum in Pittsburgh with the chickens?
Oh, the Children's Museum,
the Children's
yes.
Museum, right, where you choose a persona, a role when you come into the site. And I think MoMA has done this to some extent in their new site too. And I just wonder what you think about that compared to the ilovemuseums.com example. I kind of prefer the ilovemuseums.com where it's just a little bit looser. I always hate getting forms and having to fill in, what are you? I much prefer that, well, today I'm hungover, tomorrow I'm feeling romantic or whatever. And Tate Britain did this wonderfully with paper brochures you can pick up in the museum, the I'm Feeling Blue tour, I haven't been here in ages tour.
Sure.
And I just wonder, how do you gauge those two models against one another in terms of effectiveness?
I mean, I agree with you that I like this more as well. I think, though, when I remember all those mostly mothers who I talked to on the phone at the Spy Museum who were coming to D.C., they didn't want an I like it to be inspired. They wanted I'm coming with 6th graders and we're coming for 3 days and what should we do? And I don't think that requiring them to do some more artistic exercise would be anything but an exercise in frustration for that kind of person. And so I do think that from an audience perspective, and let me pull up, since I've mentioned it a few times, this is this Go Smithsonian site. How many people have looked at this site? And I'm curious, is it run by the magazine? Is that how this works?
It's produced by the magazine.
Produced by the magazine.
In collaboration with everyone else.
So, excellent. So what Go Smithsonian does is they sort of aggregate how you might visit the Smithsonian, some lodging ideas, museums, events. They aggregate exhibits that are coming up. They even have this map of the mall, and so you can click on individual buildings. And I guess I feel like compared to this, which is about you already know what Air and Space is about, or even like more oddly, the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. Well, I know what the Hirshhorn Museum is about, but does somebody from Ohio who's looking at this trying to decide what they want to do in D.C. know what it's about? Maybe not. So this is one way to go. The I Like Museums way is another way to go. I think both of those imply some familiarity overall. And I think that with a experience and a place as overwhelming and potentially disorienting as D.C., in many cases, starting from an audience-first perspective might be very satisfying to people who are looking to plan a visit. So I think both are interesting. You know, what MoMA does, MoMA at the very bottom of their site has this welcome, are you, and then click to pick a perspective, a first-time visitor, a returning, a film goer, and all it really changes is it shows me now on this little reader to find out what films are showing. So it's not as extensive as something like the Children's Museum. I think it does make sense in the context of the Children's Museum that a 5-year-old or 6-year-old who's their audience coming to this site does need something very different than what a parent needs coming to this site. And this isn't about me deciding one day I'm a kid, another day I'm a parent. This is about me getting the business side of can I bring in my stroller and that kind of thing, which I think people also need coming to museums. Well, I think it's probably reasonable for us to wrap up. I would really like to encourage and request and support for each of you really to pick one audience that you're interested in. You know, one kind of visitor. And figure out one way you're going to listen to them and provide something for them. And even if that's just, you know, I'm going to go down to the lobby on Fridays and during lunch, and I'm going to look for a harried mom, and I'm going to see what her deal is and how she's doing. Or I'm going to go online and find some people who are really interested in Tlingit canoes, and I'm going to find out what they're looking into. Just start with one audience that's of interest just personally to you. Let the people in the castle figure out what the overall audience priority is. You're allowed to have your own audience that you're interested in. And, you can be like Mariam, this curator in the Netherlands, for whom that has become a really personal and exciting way for her to connect to new people around the thing that she's most passionate about her job. So I hope that you'll take this and make something happen. I hope you'll share it with me and with the rest of the people who are in this room and in the greater world of people interested in this stuff. And I just want to thank you for coming and sharing this time. Thanks.